Merseyside.
We'll have some of that. 3 minutes past 5. The main news story today has been the fact that politicians from all parties have been paying tribute to the former Liberal Democrat leader Charles Kennedy, who's died suddenly at the age of 55. Police confirmed there are no suspicious circumstances. Mr. Kennedy stood down as Lib Dem leader after his battle with alcoholism became public. Someone who knew Charles Kennedy very well, both as politician and friend, is the former Liverpool Lib Dem MP, now Lord David Alton.
He was a paid-up member of the human race. He was the kind of person that you would want to spend private time with, as well as having a political friendship with, and I shared most of his political opinions, and we sort of reinforced one another's views as the years went by. But it was more than that. He was someone that you could have a great conversation with. There was no self-importance attached to Charles.
Well, pleased to stay in the studio tonight with me is Dr. Mike Finn from Liverpool Hope University, who was Charles Kennedy's last head of research and political speechwriter in the leader's office in 2005 to 6 and his principal policy advisor between 2006 2010. Good evening to you, Mike. Thanks for coming in.
Thank you.
So, I mean, just to go back to 2005 to 2006, in many ways, you know, his crowning achievement, all those seats, 65 seats for the Lib Dems in that election.
Absolutely. I mean, I think the thing that people forget is just how much of a breakthrough that really was. You know, you're talking about a party that as recently as the 1970s was genuinely able to get a shadow cabinet meeting in the back of a taxi. You know, it was a tremendous upsurge in Lib Dem parliamentary representation. And a lot of that owed a huge amount to Mr. Kennedy's charisma, to his personal style, but also to his principled opposition to the Iraq War in 2003 and the legacy that built for the party amongst a significant constituency, particularly young voters.
Yeah, and as a speechwriter then for him, he must have been a dream to write for.
He was actually one of the more difficult people I've written for.
Really?
I've written for a lot of people, and once speechwriters will tell you this, but once you've built a relationship with someone, it's actually relatively straightforward. But with Charles was such a spontaneous character that he had a terrible tendency to go off script, which is great because he was a real person, and he vindicated that all the time. If you're a speechwriter, though, that's the last thing you want.
True, yeah.
You want them to stay on their marks, hit their marks.
Yeah.
So I remember one time, actually, after he ceased to be leader, he was given a sort of valedictory speech at the party conference the following year, and I wrote the speech for him or with him, and he promptly just ignored the speech and went off on one for 45 minutes about social justice. That was Charles, and that's why people responded to him, because he was a real person.
True enough. Did leadership become him? Because although he had this great number of seats in that election, I read today that he was slightly disorganised as well, and that was part of his personality too.
Yeah, I think there's different. I mean, he was a unusual sort of politician. It's fair to say. Disorganised, I think he was a mercurial figure in some ways. What I'd say is that he was actually very shrewd. I think one of the things that his critics used to zone in on was it took him a long time to make decisions, but I don't think that implied disorganisation. I think that implied someone who considered his options very carefully. And when he did make the calls, I mean, obviously I'm biased, but speaking from a biased perspective, he tended to make the right ones from my point of view. And I think a lot of people, particularly with the Iraq question, but also with other things too, like putting a penny on income tax for education or no university tuition fees, those sorts of policy decisions that he considered very, very carefully along with his Liberal Democrat colleagues. Those sorts of things resonate with people. So I think he was a shrewd person. He was actually more introverted than people realise.
And in all this, Mike, in your associations with him, how did you see his medical problems and his alcoholism affect him?
I think, obviously a lot of it's public record and it's well documented. And I came in towards the end of his leadership when it was becoming public record and it was becoming well documented. I think the issue with Charles actually was just the sudden bursts of energy. He had sudden bursts of energy. He was incredibly productive and people saw that. And there were obviously these periods when it wasn't quite as productive. But I think through all that, he still managed to embody certain values and certain personality which people responded to, irrespective of the medical problems that he faced, that people became aware of. So I think notwithstanding that, I mean, the old adage about Winston Churchill, Winston Churchill had certain medical problems that were fairly similar and did rather well as both a Liberal politician and a Conservative Prime Minister. So I'd like to consider Charles in that lineage, really.
Yeah, he was a real Highland man. I mean, his constituency there with Ben Nevis, as majestic as it is, standing strong in Fort William. Did you ever go up there? Did you ever experience that?
I did go up to the constituency, although I have to say, Charles had a standing joke, which I believe Alistair Campbell's repeated today, that he'd never been up Ben Nevis, even though it was right next to him, because it was too much energy. And that again was characteristic Charles. But if you go to the constituency, Roskilde and Lochaber, if you go to that part of the world, he was a Highlander. He was a crofter's son.
Yeah.
He still had a croft. He was very much, that kind of rural Highland Scot with all the romances associated with that, and yet at the same time became an MP at the very young age of 23, catapulted into Parliament, and when he arrived he had that charm, and I don't think he ever really lost that charm. I don't think he ever really lost that rural charm and that kind of boyishness that he had. And when you go to his constituency, you can see why he loved life just as virulently as he did, because it was such a beautiful place.
I heard one poignant line today which said that politics became his life, but in the end it was politics that took his life. Do you think that's true? Do you think it was, the Westminster bubble, the House of Commons, if you're an alcoholic, is a very easy place to get booze. There's bonhomie in spades, To
be honest with you, I mean, obviously, a lot of people are zoning in on the alcoholism and the specific health problem. I'm not saying this to deflect, but I'm being deadly serious here. I think with respect to him, I think there's something in that quote, but it might not be about the drink. I think the thing that's in the quote is that politics was his life. Politics was his vocation, it was his job, but it was also his hobby. He lived and breathed it in a way that even other politicians who are driven don't. And what I mean by that is the tragedy of Charles Kennedy, as much as the alcohol, as much as the health problems, was that he had a long time where he was marginalised in politics. He ceased to be leader nearly a decade ago now. And in that period, he was a backbench MP for most of it, and he watched the Lib Dems change out of all recognition. I think that was the tragedy, and in many ways, that may be what has contributed to what's happened recently.
Dr. Mike Finn, great to talk to you. Thanks so much for coming in. From Liverpool Hope University, he was Charles Kennedy's last head of research and indeed his political speechwriter in the leader's office in 2005 and 2006.
Simon Hoban,
BBC Radio Merseyside.
Just coming up